So let me introduce today's speaker. It's Professor Arthur Petersen, standing here next to me. He's Professor of Science, Technology and Public Policy at UCL, University College London, and also editor of Zygon, which is a journal of religion and science. So he's very well qualified to speak in this forum. He was, for 13 years, he was a scientific advisor on the environment and infrastructure policy for the Dutch government as well. So he's got doctorate degrees in atmospheric sciences and the philosophy of science, which links those two aspects of science and religion. And today, as you'll see, he's talking on uncertainty, nature and God. So without further ado, over to you.
So thank you very much, and thank you for hosting me here in Cambridge at the Faraday Institute. It's one of those entities when I'm getting to know the field a bit better of science and religion, which has been kind of a hobby for a very long time for me, but now it's part of my profession as well as being the editor of Zygon as part of my job. It's also good to learn about the UK landscape in science and religion. As you may know, the Zygon journal, I'll say a little bit at the end, is typically a US enterprise, but I'm the second European editor, so we are trying to shift to have the debate that has been going on in Zygon, to keep it global, so also not just European and US, but globalizing it as far as possible. So today's talk is kind of two parts. So the first part is laying out a particular position I have been developing over the past few years under this label of Transcendental Naturalism, and I'm not much married to the term, but I want to explain my position using those terms and also open for any suggestions in terms of how you should call such a position, which kind of developed as a third doctoral project, which is pretty crazy. So I just submitted my third doctorate to University of Oxford, which has this same title, will be examined in December, so let's see how well I do today in defending this position. But it's in theology, although it's more of philosophy, I would say, than theology. And a starting point for me, and that's across my whole career, starting in science, but also in the science and policy, and then in science, religion, and policy, has been the issue of uncertainty and ignorance. So my second doctorate was on how you deal with uncertainties in computer simulation, and how do you deal with that specifically pertaining to climate change, and how do you discuss those uncertainties in decision making and policy making. And one example of bodies I've been participating in and I've studied is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I have one little example more on science, religion and public policy, also pertaining to the IPCC, but that's where a lot of my, I would say, social science background and science policy linking skills come from, participating also for 13, 14 years in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In terms of naturalism and what may be some issues with that, originally I changed the title for this lecture because during my research I thought at the beginning I was against naturalism. But I discovered I'm not. I'm against a particular form of naturalism, so I learned a lot very recently, so I had to change the title also of this talk. And it is particularly, I have problems with scientism and scientistic forms of naturalism, and I'll get to what that is in terms of some definitions as well. But let me focus first on three problems that I think are caused by too naive and too scientistic forms of naturalism. And that's one of them is the portrayal that science and focusing on the scientific worldview is leading to a disenchantment in the world. So there's a disenchantment of nature as one of the problems, in a sense. If you look at what's happening in society, in culture, if it's too much dominated by a focus on a scientific worldview, is where is religious meaning going, where is the enchantment going? And I've been studying this question using a lens which isn't used that often in science and religion, by asking the question, what's the role of poetics in science? What's the role of poetics in religion, as well as in policy making? And I found a number of interesting authors. One of them is, he is now deceased, but a very good historian of science, Fernand Alain, who wrote, it was in French, it was translated into English, a beautiful book which is titled The Poetic Structure of the World, and he focuses there on Copernicus and Kepler. But it's a beautiful narrative on the role of poetics in their science, in their mathematics, the role of the ellipsis for Kepler, for instance, or you will have heard about the music of the spheres as well, but there is a deep analysis in that book of the role of poetics, poetry in doing science. And then there is some other reactions in terms against scientism. One is by Alistair McGrath, an older book, and another one that I've dealt with in some detail. And there's an interesting thematic section on her book as well in one of the recent issues of Zygon, which is a book by Lisa Sederis titled Consecrating Science. And she is very critical. And I have an open question about that. So the big question is, can we create modern myth on the basis of our scientific research and cosmology and evolution in order to motivate people to act to save the planet? And there's lots of narrative out there in terms of the epic of evolution. There's a strong link, a strong call for environmental action coming from explicitly, I would say, non-traditional or non-religious scientific or scientistic, often naturalist views that try to seek meaning in the world through our understanding of science. Now, I think there's great opportunities there, and I think it's important that those narratives are out there. But what Lisa Sederis here analyzes is the problem of motivating, for instance, young people just on the basis of science to care for nature vis-a-vis versus, for instance, experiencing nature. And I think there are all sorts of combinations that can be made that can make it work. But in her narrative, she is very critical of creating new poetry, or sometimes even new religion. You may have heard of religious naturalism, that you create a new religion on the basis of science and science alone. So that's one set of questions I've been trying to grapple with. The second set of questions is related to this problem of rationality and the idea that it gives you one single answer. If you do science properly, you will find the right answer. Also the idea that uncertainty is of a fleeting nature. We will reduce uncertainty through further research. So there is, and I would say, also a lack of acknowledgement in many scientific researchers of the value-ladenness of their own scientific research. And value-ladenness, I have a very broad interpretation of that. So you can start with just epistemic values or disciplinary values, that you are bound by the values in your discipline. But there can also be deeper religious, social, political values that underpin how you do your research. Especially the type of science I've been looking at is science for policy, for instance. Thinking of toxicology or epidemiology, and ways, assumptions in those sciences have values embedded in them that are not always explicitly reflected. And many scientists find it difficult to reflect on that from their view of what rationality is. So we have the question of how to discuss then the authorities, where the authority of science is coming from, versus where authority of other positions are coming from. And there's an interesting book I'm discussing here, a recent book by Alistair McGrath. Must be careful here, this is recorded, he's my supervisor. So I have an interesting engagement with him in that chapter, which you can read after the book is published next year. But he confronts, let's say, the rationality of science with the rationality of theology, and he puts them on a kind of equal footing. Now, I don't buy all that, but fine. What I find another very interesting position who is, so that's someone who's coming from a theistic position as well, right? I think one of the best philosophers of science at the moment is Joseph Rouse, who is a society where he's active as well with philosophy of science in practice. He's written books in the 80s already on knowledge and power. This is one of his latest books, Articulating the World, where he makes an evolutionary analysis of the origins of conceptual thinking and of science. And he says we can be complete naturalists. We don't have to assume anything else than our naturalistic position to also explain science and also the normativity of truth in science. And I'll get to some of those terms. I think it's a fascinating book. It's a very well studied book, and I'm trying to get to grips in my analysis with that book. And one of the specific applications here is how can we relate science advice, where we have this deep uncertainty and all these different values, and I would say there is real normativity, and those values really hold also from different parts of culture. And how do you get to grips to modern rationality ideas, which Rouse also criticizes, where you think we have a method and we can just determine in the scientific way what the truth is. A third set of problems related to modernity, I would label that as a kind of mutual disregard. Science on the one hand and non-modern worldviews on the other. And you see a lot of confrontation in that if you look at science advice in developing countries. But I think there are many examples in developed countries as well. So what I did there is I used a couple of chapters actually in this very handsome standard work, the Oxford Handbook on Religion and Science, and I used a very interesting introduction to the philosophy of science, religious studies, the scientific study of religions, as well as the philosophy of religion, in order to think through, okay, how do different frames and different cultures think about the future, and how open-ended is the future, and to relate it to a particular practice. And I'll give an example at the end of something we studied in Southeast Asia with respect to this. Modern planning. How do modern ways to plan using models and science deal with indigenous knowledge, non-modern worldviews? So this is just to set the scene to now elaborate some of my position in transcendental naturalism. First, defining naturalism is a very tricky thing. So I relied on one of the chapters in this 2006 Oxford Handbook, where Flanagan has, I think, a useful definition where you define naturalism as being opposed to a particular form of supernaturalism. And this is what is the position that naturalists are against, the position of supernaturalism. So there exists a supernatural being or beings or powers outside the natural world. This is component 1. Component 2 is this being or power has causal commerce with the world. And, crucially as well, the grounds for belief in the supernatural being, they cannot be seen, discovered, and by way of any known reliable epistemic method. So it's coming from outside of science, but there is this kind of causal interaction of a being that's outside of the world. This is a typical definition of a supernaturalistic position, and you can define then naturalism as the position that objects to that. And I think I formulated the position that objects to that keeps a lot of religion open, and I will come to that, and why and how I think it's useful. But you can see that I would think that the position that counter that and say the only source for knowledge at all is through science is problematic. So that kind of naturalism won't do it. So my approach, what I did was I just gave a lecture this morning on qualitative research to my students in London, and this is the utmost version of qualitative research because I read a few million words, half of it in German, and I wrote 100,000 words on it, and I was saying, well, qualitative research is on words instead of numbers, so there are hardly any numbers well, I just gave you some numbers on numbers of words, but this is a real philosophical approach by reading deeply into the works of three philosophers, three completely different philosophers that are really never discussed, although James and Latour are sometimes discussed in connection, but in connection, which I think are neglected in science and religion, very much so, except for William James a bit because of his varieties of religious experience, but not in terms of his wider philosophy. Heinrich Rickert, which is a neo-Kantian philosopher, which is a very unusual suspect here, which I will explain why he is there. And then Bruno Latour, who is, I think, a very versatile both social scientist and philosopher. And my approach then is to first, in terms of looking at this previous definition of naturalism and the problem of scientism, to say, well, I try to really be naturalistic and respect the methods and claims of science, so not have something outside of the world that kind of intervenes and then contradicts also science. And that's very much in line also with, let's say, pragmatist philosophy like William James. But I also think there is real value, philosophical value, in upholding the specific nature of values. And I'm focusing on their a priori nature, and I will say something more about that. A priori has often been associated, which means it's not directly from experience, right? These values that you get your knowledge about them, or perceptual experience, to be more precise. Often a priori values have been associated with certainty, and that's the link I want to destroy in this book. So for me, you can be very uncertain or ignorant about a priori values, which still exist in the world. Now, I'll develop the position in a bit more detail in a few minutes. So now, what do I take from these three philosophers? So William James, one of these American pragmatists who came after Peirce. What I take from that type of philosophy is a focus on practices and a very strong focus, given also my interest in ignorance and uncertainty, in the fallibility of knowledge claims, fallibility of judgment even more broadly. So it's not only about knowledge, it's also about ethics, and it's also about religion. So that's William James. William James was a contemporary of Heinrich Rickert, and they had interactions with each other through their books, talking past each other largely, which I analyze, because Heinrich Rickert is an exponent of neo-Kantian philosophy, which is typically a very dry type of certainty-orienting, a priori philosophizing, but I find in Rickert, who has largely not been translated into English, so I had to read all his works in German, but he focuses very much on the role of values in judgment, a priori values, while acknowledging at the same time that in real cultures, these values are realized in infallible ways. And actually I discovered a lot of uncertainty thinking in this neo-Kantian, which is kind of an exception in the lot. But I think he has a very valuable philosophy that we can use, we can learn from. He is not at the moment a famous philosopher. He was the most famous philosopher at the turn of the century. Same with James, who was kind of out of it in American philosophy, and Rickert was out of it in German philosophy, this whole neo-Kantian approach. But he was kind of the teacher of Heidegger, Walter Benjamin, and he was a friend of Max Weber, so the sociologist Max Weber used the philosophy of Heinrich Rickert to underpin his sociology. So it used to be quite an influential philosopher, and I think he needs to be restudied, rediscovered. And recently, his works have been started to be collected, and his completed works are now being published in German, not yet in English translation. And the final philosopher. Now, before that, let me show, because I want to show an analogy with Bruno Latour as well. This is from his 1921 book from Heinrich Rickert, where he was trying to do his volume 1 of his system for philosophy. He only published one volume. But at the end of the book, there is a fold-out table, which I reprint here. You don't have to read it, it's German terms. But what he shows here is the 8 different types of values that exist, a priori values, from science to aesthetics to ethics, religion. So I won't go into detail on these values, but he is very systematic about these values and their existence, and you can study them. Philosophy is a study of culture and how values realize themselves in culture. Now, Bruno Latour, who says, and he's this kind of writer, it's hard to summarize Latour. It's a very unsystematic thinker. It's a very French kind of author. His type of philosophy, you could call it empirical philosophy. He frames himself as either an anthropologist or sociologist. But what he does is going out and studying culture and looking for different values that play out and have different roles in this culture. And he has, again, similar to Rickert, at the end of his book, again, you don't have to read it, but he has this kind of table where we have all the 15 odd different values that play a role in culture and how they're realized, from the mode of reference is here to the mode of religion and law, and there's all these different value domains, modes of existence, as he called them. Now, and I think he is, in the end, his philosophy is kind of an unreflexive combination of this pragmatist approach. And he loves William James, and he reads it through Whitehead and Isabelle Singer. He says he hates Kantians, but I think he's a closet neo-Kantian. And at first I thought he should be the external examiner for the thesis, but then I thought, no, he should not be the external examiner for the thesis. So someone else is doing that. So religious outlooks is then the final question I deal with in my thesis and book as well, in terms of, okay, if you have this kind of approach of a transcendental naturalist approach, it's kind of, and it's like with Kant and like with Rickert, you say we'd want to get rid of the old-fashioned metaphysics. So this is a kind of post-metaphysical approach, but you're not saying we want to get rid of religion, because it's a real phenomenon and it really has to be understood and explained. You're just saying that the profession of philosophy cannot give any grounding of theism. It cannot give any grounding of atheism, or let's say, or another position, an agnostic position. So this is, in the end, a position that caters to these different religious options, which are then metaphysical choices and religious choices, which are outside of the field of philosophy. And what I like about this approach is the openness to the possibility of further choices you can make, without being able to give philosophical demonstrations of these approaches. Now, I'm very much aware that there are many people out there trying to philosophically demonstrate religions, beliefs, and that's fine. But from this kind of position, it's like, well, you are doing, you're straddling the boundaries. You are in the realm of metaphysics, where you cannot, in the end, really prove things. So it's all in a very deeply uncertain and ignorance-laden realm. So that's the whole approach outlined. And then I have 7 main chapters in my book, with longer titles, but some actually do have these kind of short titles, going from wonder to judgment to values to models to poetics to authorities to futures, where I systematically develop this position of transcendental naturalism in the first part, and then apply that to the problems I started with in the beginning of my talk. And let me just highlight what is the main thesis I develop in each of these chapters, and then I'll get to some very practical examples. So, a whole chapter on wonder. I actually did look at Helen de Cruz's talk for the Faraday Institute, because this is very much related to the research that she has been presenting here as well, on the importance of wonder and awe in the practice of science itself. So in that chapter, I do compare the practice of science and religion, focusing on the emotion of wonder. And I think the emotion of wonder is a very interesting way you can empirically study, in terms of emotions in being embedded in particular practices, of what uncertainty and ignorance do to people who are in those practices. And there are also in scientific practices many examples where you can intimate metaphysical transcendence, is how I call it now. And there are many ways to go about that. So there's examples from Werner Heisenberg, who has discovered these beautiful equations and goes out on a walk and he thinks, of course, he has seen something of the mind of God or things like that. Equations prove to be wrong, but that doesn't matter. It's the experience here of a relationship with metaphysical transcendence, which is an interesting link, I think, between science and religion and marriage. Much further study also from a social and psychological perspective. Then I have a whole chapter on judgment. So I use a lot of William James. I introduce my three philosophers as well as in the chapter. So this chapter introduces then William James. This chapter introduces Heinrich Rickert, but then also Immanuel Kant, because I also then focused very closely on especially his third critique, his critique on of the power of judgment, going very deeply into what judgment is, and then also looking at the role of freedom and aesthetics in reaching judgment. And this is in science, on thinking this is a beautiful equation and it must be true, something like that, right? It's an aesthetic notion there that helps you do your science, as well as this is a prayer that works for me, or a psalm, or an evensong, or whatever, religious ritual. It's a similar kind of freedom that you can choose for using particular language or growing into particular language, which has an aesthetic component, so that's how it links to your emotion. And then you arrive at a judgment pertaining to a truth value, a religious value, or any other value, the beauty of a painting, whatever. And what's important again is I focus on these values and their a priori existence and validity, but there remains always uncertainty and ignorance, and practices evolve, and we learn to deal differently with these different values. So that's a whole chapter on judgment. Then I have a whole chapter on values, where I use Bruno Latour as one of the entry points, but of course do a lot with Heinrich Rickert's philosophy of value, because Heinrich Rickert is more explicit in his philosophy of value than Latour. And I make the step where I argue values are part of nature, are part of the world, and they are assumed in judgment. So there's a strong link between those two, and that's the transcendental approach. Any judgment, you have to assume a value, and that's what is meant with this word transcendental. And of course, you do make these judgments in different contexts under freedom, which means that there's inherent intrinsic uncertainty attached to those values and what we say and know about them. Then a chapter on models. I've done a whole doctorate on models before, but which was really on social studies of science, philosophy of science, climate change models. But this is a more broader notion of models. Also religious models and models for as they play a role in making policies, where in the end I have to take a position on realism, and I end up with a particular form of what I call referential realism, where I say if you have these models which are concepts, and these models refer to experiences and percepts in experiences where there's always uncertainty and ignorance remaining. So for instance, in religious models, let's say God the Father, it does refer to particular experiences or emotions, but it is similarly a mode of reference as an electron refers to an electron, but it's also through experiences of how, through which actions in a laboratory you actually have to do with an electron. And there's lots of similarities there in how the mode of reference works, how referential realism works. Then a chapter on poetics, where I offer this option also in science, that you always have poetics as a necessary component really to read meaning in practices, and you can have, it can be religious meaning, it can be also scientific meaning, and it's again with poetics it's very clear that it's not like prose. It's much more focused on the openness and the things that you cannot express, which characterize it, which makes it again interesting to study from uncertainty and ignorance perspectives. Then a chapter on authorities, where I focus on the need to recognize a plurality of authorities within a practice of science, within a practice of religion, but also in crossings between these different practices. And I focus as a case there on the role of expert judgment in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because what we often see is that it's very difficult for scientists to be explicit about the fact they just bring their experience and their knowledge and their values in the room, and then they have a discussion with other climate scientists in this case on how certain are we that humans are causing climate change, for instance. And they arrive at a judgment. They find it very hard to reflect on the differences they all have. They find it very hard to reflect on that is still a value-laden judgment, and there are other views both in the room and outside. And finally, a chapter on futures, where I really emphasize the need to keep futures open, again to go against the use of science, the abuse of science, where you don't realize that science is deeply uncertain, where you use models too easily to make particular predictions and then take action on that, where you may have taken other actions if you would have listened to other views as well. And we'll give an example at the end. So this is the outline of the book. I invite you, if I survive the Wi-Fi and if it gets published, hopefully with a good university press, to read it hopefully next year. So this is a primer. I'm happy to answer questions on any of these. So let me now change tack a bit and give then some examples from my practice as a science advisor on where all these kind of themes impinge on that practice in science, religion and public policy. There's a picture here again from an early book of Latour, 91 book, translated in 93, We've Never Been Modern, where what he studies and what he is interested in is all these hybrid networks, all these linkages being made, for instance, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that I studied in those terms, where there is government representatives, like me, I was representing the Dutch government, negotiating with the authors on what the best summary of the science should be. And there are all sorts of values and things at play. So I do influence from a political value of the Netherlands on how sea level rise is represented in the report or not. I failed actually in the Paris negotiations. That's the 2007 one, to get a good statement on the possibility of a few meters sea level rise, which we have seen it in the past. There were papers that were published about that, but the authors didn't dare to put it in the summary. And I couldn't get it in. But sometimes you are more successful. At the end, what's represented is, we have these completely separate values of science. So the IPCC is just science, it's nature, it's the truth, right? It's what we know. And then there's politics that has to make decisions. And I think there's merit to that because there is a mode of speak in the IPCC where you have to still be scientifically accurate and you have to give a good representation of the chapters, and there's a veto right for the authors and any changes, etc., etc., etc. So it's good to do that, but it's also neglecting that there is this real intersection and real interaction. And one phrase I've been using for this is post-normal science. There are other phrases that we can use for this, but I worked with Jerry Raffets and Sylvia van de Beach in the Dutch government in the early 2000s to introduce methods to be more explicit about situations like in climate change where there's huge uncertainties, but there's also real different stakes and political values, which means in bodies such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you have to be prepared. It's not the standard way of doing science, but it's also not the standard way of doing politics, and that's the interesting thing about such bodies. And we try to have an approach like that also in the Netherlands government, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, where I had to teach the employees on how do we deal with these types of problems when we have to advise policy on these kind of topics. And one of the things I kept telling my colleagues, and I keep training also in the Master of Public Administration that we teach in London, it's all about you experts, us experts coming from science, being aware of the assumptions we make, being able to be reflexive. And often when they came in the room, they've never heard the word reflexive, which is worrying. Where did they get their academic training, you then think? So you have to be reflexive. You have to be able to reflect on either you're an economist or ecologist. We typically have those two in the room to demonstrate that they may come from different assumptions. Or sometimes we had toxicologists and epidemiologists, and they had completely different views on issues when we had them in the same room. So be reflexive about that. And then I was hired by the government to introduce methods to deal with uncertainty. And I told them, sorry, I'm not delivering a protocol, and I'm also not delivering a silver bullet. There are many tools for talking about uncertainty, for analyzing uncertainty, for calculating uncertainty, but all these are just tools. They're not the solution. These uncertainties remain, and you have to find ways to get to grips with that. And then I had often the response, you focus on uncertainty, but as soon as we talk about that, it becomes politicized. And then I say, well, yes and no. Of course it becomes politicized, but any knowledge you put into the process is politicized. Making political choices and decisions is making decisions under uncertainty and under risk. So you have a responsibility, if you offer advice which is really uncertain, to do that in a way that decision makers can weigh the different risks of believing a particular statement. So you have to help them interpret. What's the risk of me believing this is true? What's the risk of me not believing this is true? And there are ways to do that and to communicate about that also, not just with the decision makers, but with a larger audience. And I invite you to download this. It's just a 30-page document, but I'm still very happy with it. We published the first version in 2003, the second in 2013, which is the PBL Netherlands Environment Assessment Guidance for Uncertainty Assessment and Communication, where with all these different elements where you have to look at if you do science advice. It's not just about mapping the uncertainties and calculating them and reporting them. It's actually thinking about the framing of the problem that we are addressing and thinking about different stakeholders that have different frames, thinking about indicators that represent the problem, and thinking about what knowledge do we have, what knowledge do we need. And just to show a last diagram on this, we produced a matrix of all the different types of uncertainty that you can encounter, different locations. Can we calculate them statistically, or do we not have numbers? Is it knowledge related or variability related? Do we have an assessment of how strong the knowledge is or how weak? There's a qualitative measure of uncertainty. And then, this is the relevant column, which is why I'm showing this, the value ladenness of choices that we make. And the value ladenness is not just epistemic values, disciplinary values, social values, but also religious and worldview values that you have to be aware of when you advise on really ethically charged policy issues. So there are 4 lessons I learned in being an advisor to science policy interface. I'm going to share those. So when I talk about post-normal science, often scientists become angry because they think I'm throwing away their science, which I am absolutely not. So take normal science seriously. Use as much as we can of normal science, of knowledge that we can gain through normal practices in science. But once that science becomes embedded in a larger societal context, we need to devise better and new ways, and you can label them post-normal science or otherwise, where we connect that knowledge with decision making. So that's the first point, which then leads to an explicit reflection on uncertainty and values. The second point is what I learned when I started dealing with uncertainty. It was all about statistics. Uncertainty is an error bar. It's a reliability interval, 95% confidence interval. And we discovered, going through this, the more important part of dealing with reliability is the methodological reliability, is talking about the strengths and the weaknesses in the underpinning knowledge. So you have to talk about the methodological reliability. And then I was also, with an unfortunate central role in the Dutch government, with ClimateGate and issues with errors in the IPCC and emails that were leaked. There is a whole public reliability issue as well. If you want to advise governments on science, you need to earn their trust. Happy to answer questions on that in the question time. This is a very central notion in post-normal science, extended peer review. So if you then acknowledge that we have to devise new methods to also review the science, then these chapters, for instance, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have to be sent out for peer review to Greenpeace, and they have their expert look at it, and to Coal Lobby, and they have their expert look at this, and this is good. Extended peer review increases, if you have the proper procedures, increases the quality of the summaries of the science, of the uncertainty assessment, and that can include also even non-specialists. Although to give a comment that changes a summary, you have to be technical enough in order to submit that comment that leads to a change. You cannot just say, I don't agree. And And what I learned as well, which is why I had to write this book, which I didn't have time for, so for the second time I did it as part of a doctorate while having another job. But I started to see that there are much deeper layers at play than what people state that they're doing, and you really have to get to grips to what are these deeper layers of ignorance and uncertainty and different values that collide in practice. So with a graphic, how all these things come together from, let's say, Latour's terminology in this problem of climate change, you can say, yes, it is about science. That's the mode of reference. It is about our data where we see warming. It is about our models that we connect to that data where we can say it's humans causing that warming. But that's not, of course, the only aspect in dealing with uncertainties about climate change and thinking about the future. There's a very important role for narratives and imagining, and I'm talking also about climate change mitigation and the new technologies and new energies. New energy technologies. There's a role for fiction here, both in the drama fiction in terms of we don't change anything, we have a 5-degree world, but also how beautiful can a world be where we have these renewable energies. So there's a strong role for fiction, which is different from science, of course. Then there's a very beautiful chapter, I think, on psychiatry in Latour's book, where we will be in a kind of psychosis or shock from discovering that climate change is actually really real. And we may need to have a fundamental change in how we perceive both our own behavior and the world. So there is even a psychiatry element there in terms of a religion, a cultural domain that plays a role. Then, of course, ethics, morality, economics. He clusters it a bit too much in one term, morality, Latour, but that's very obvious how that plays a role in thinking through who is benefiting and who is losing from both the climate change and from the measures to tackle climate change. Politics, of course, very simply defined by Latour, is getting a group behind you, and there's more behind that, of course, but it's another part of culture where the value is really to constitute a group. And it's different from other parts of culture. The law, how you link cases to each other, is a separate part of culture. How we organize ourselves, procedures, scripts, processes. Also within the IPCC, how we manage to produce successfully a summary for policymakers under these constellations is because we have particular scripts to do that. It's organized in a particular way with rules to end up with a report that's both scientifically correct and politically accepted. Then doing technology and engineering. I work in an engineering sciences faculty, so there is a separate domain of culture which is about the tinkering related to engineering and technology. And last but not least, we have this, or not even last, there are even more modes of existence according to Latour, but on this slide, this mode of religion, where there's this question of what are the deeper values that we care about, and how does that link to addressing issues of climate change. Now what we often do, let me put this slide on, in trying to link science to policy is to act as if it's all simple. And we all do that, also me as science advisors. We try to structure something. I get a question from a politician and I give an answer. I get a hearing in a parliament and I give an answer. Fine, if the question is really simple, we'll really try to move in that direction. I have some examples of where that works. It works if you're an engineer and you're advising on how to do road maintenance. Yes, great. Let's do it that way. Speaking truth to power in that sense, cool. Road maintenance. However, if we are in the opposite kind of corner, where we have an unstructured problem, where people come from really different values, and it's not clear which scientist you should actually ask the question to, we are in this kind of place of an unstructured problem for climate change, sustainable development. Now, two interesting intermediate cases. One, for instance, is on particulate matter. We all care about air pollution going down in a sense, or we don't want to be affected on our health by air pollution. But there is a wide-ranging scientific debate on which are the particles that are causing the problem that the epidemiologists see. Is it the sulfate particles? Is it diesel engine particles? And there's still a debate. So this is a separate kind of question, right? You have advocates for different positions. And then a role that scientists could take for a different type of problems where the uncertainties are not the issue in science, but the values are the main issue. You have a completely different role as an expert when you talk in the public as a medical expert on, for instance, abortion of euthanasia. It's a completely different register. So in terms of the roles you can take, you can solve a problem as an advisor in this one, but you cannot solve the problems in the other ones. And the weakest in the sense is you can only help structure and recognize problems. And I think also that's what the IPCC is partly doing. If they talk about these questions, not just about are humans causing climate change? Yes, 95% certainty now. Next time will be 99%. So that's not the ball game. The big question is, of course, can we still get below 2 degrees? Can we get below 1.5 degrees? What are the ways we can do that? Everybody who's working on that is also inputting their knowledge into the IPCC. Can they give the answer to that question? Of course they cannot. They can only structure how we can approach those questions. They cannot say we can't. They cannot say we can. But there are all sorts of options that are available. And interestingly, this is some pictures from the IPCC, and then I will end. Just to give you a feel of how this works, where all these different parts of culture come together. So you have these scientists on the stage, world-leading scientists. The best scientists of the world are chairing this UN body. It's incredible. We have a UN body out there where the top scientists, this was the round where we had Susan Solomon, the best stratospheric scientist in the world. She was co-chairing this working group 1 of the IPCC. Then we have the authors who are sitting there together, who have written the chapters. We have all the countries alphabetically, with the Netherlands always sitting next to New Zealand, which knows, we know exactly the New Zealand position, and it's interesting how the alphabet influences world politics. But it does. All the say alphabetically situated countries, and then at the back we have all the interests. Coal lobby, oil lobby, Greenpeace, right? And some running to specific countries. Since this will be public, I won't name the countries, but you can imagine a country where Greenpeace will be running to and a country where the oil lobby will be running to. Because what then happens is there are 20 pages that are in the summary of, let's say, 2,000 pages of report of chapters. Countries have submitted 100 pages of comments, and then the authors put it on the screen and say, this is our latest version in track changes, and then it's highlighted the sentence, and then the chair asks, is there any country in the world that has any comment on this sentence? That's the process. And the only way to agree is by consensus in the UN. And it works through the rules and procedures. If it takes too long in the plenary, so this is a Dutch delegation, 2013. These delegations are done differently as well. So the Dutch delegation always has its Met Office in the lead. So this was the person from the Met Office. I was the chief scientist for infrastructure and environment. This was the policy maker. Other governments, the Germans, have the environment ministry in the lead. Or the Saudis have their mineral affairs ministry in the lead. Or the US, the State Departments, every government does it in a different way. And interestingly, all these different stakes and values keep each other in check throughout this process. If you cannot get a solution, well, you appoint, in this case, we didn't have comments on a particular sentence, so this is the Netherlands and India. You say, can those two governments co-chair a contact group where we find a solution because we cannot get to an agreement in the plenary? And in the end, we're always able to find a solution. Now, one example from the IPCC on science, religion, public policy. Bolivia. This is the Japan meeting 2014, Working Group 2 on adaptation. Where's Mother Earth? Mother Earth is ingrained in our legal text. It's not in the IPCC report. It should be, because you're going to propose huge scale bioenergy capture and then carbon capture and storage. You will do that also in South America. We have a right, and Mother Earth has a right, to be consulted in terms of measures to counter climate change. Where's Mother Earth? And then, of course, the scientists, like, there's no peer-reviewed article that mentions Mother Earth, so we cannot include Mother Earth in the text. Yeah, okay, fine, no Mother Earth in the text, but still, they didn't let go. So, and this is an interesting representation then of some aspects of Mother Earth, or what it could mean in this kind of scientific terms, like, well, there is indigenous, local, traditional knowledge systems and practices, including indigenous people's holistic view of community and environment. They are a major resource for adapting to climate change, but these have not been used consistently in existing adaptation efforts. They could agree. So they agreed, okay, fine, we let it drop. Mother Earth is not going to enter the final text of the IPCC report. But there is this very interesting interaction happening here, which I think merits also further delving into in how this plays out. And then the final to last slide. This is a study that I did with a postdoc of mine on delta management in the Netherlands compared to delta management in Southeast Asia. And in the Netherlands we have this approach about futures and models and scenarios, and let's plan for sea level rise, and we can raise our dikes, and we just put some sand in front of a coast, so bring it on. Climate change is no problem for the Netherlands. It's an export product. We're good at it. We love it from that perspective. We also do mitigation, don't worry, it's shifting. But we export that approach as well. So we have a Vietnamese delta plan on the Dutch approach. We have a Myanmar delta plan on the Dutch approach. We have a Bangladesh delta plan on the Dutch approach. The only thing that's missing there, and we've tried, there's no Thai delta plan. And this was a nice little entry for my postdoc and me to think about. Is there something to the argument? And I got it published, so it must be true. No, I don't think it is, but it was published. Dutch Protestant approach, like thinking about progress in the future and model predictions and let's just manage and engineer our way out, versus a Buddhist approach to statecraft. Thailand is one of those countries which has never been colonized, so they do have a Buddhist approach in the role of the king and also the role of the government in making decisions. And we found some evidence there that we made this bold claim. It's due to this difference in the underpinning cultures of decision making, where this Dutch approach of let's predict the future and let's just engineer our way out of trouble is not going to work for the delta in Thailand. Way too simple, and they're modernizing there as well. So it's really interesting to further study then the clashes also in how that's playing out in this country like Thailand. But this is one example of, I think, under this new heading. So I introduced that heading as part of my program when I became the new editor-in-chief of Zygon, Journal of Religion and Science. Don't worry, it's continuing, it's old tradition, everything is still welcome, but I wanted to emphasize more that there's this new interesting field where the journal also started in the 1960s of looking at these large societal problems and what the deeper value dimensions in culture can do and which role they can play. Partly they believed we could modernize religion. This was all in the liberal part of the Protestant spectrum, right? But we could liberalize all religions everywhere with science, and then we could still use some of those religious backgrounds for the poetry and solving the world's problems. Now, I'm not sure if that's exactly also my position, as some have, let's say, propagated that also in this journal, but I'm very happy to also tell you more about the journal and the work we're doing there. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I'm giving some ingredients for discussion.
I'm sure you have. There is a microphone, if you could use that. Ruth will hand it round if you put your hand up for any comments. We've just got 5 minutes, so it'd be good to have quick comments, and then we'll move through several of them.
Thank you. Can you tell me any period in the development of the world where there hasn't been climate change? Because I think this expression climate change is rather brainwashing. Actually, the issue is AGW.
I think there has not been a period where there has not been climate change. I also think the speed that we see and the attribution to the fossil fuel emitted CO2 is, well, it's quite convincing. So I'm one of those people who is talking about the uncertainties that are left, right? So there's a 95% chance that the most of the warming that we see is coming from fossil fuel emissions.
What about AGW? Anthropogenic. Don't you know what it stands for?
Yeah, anthropogenic global warming or something like that, right? But so this is a terminology of, so I was talking about climate change, not defining it as anthropogenically caused greenhouse warming, right? So I was talking about climate change as both a natural phenomenon and the anthropogenically caused. And the attribution question is how much is caused by human influences. But you're right, that's in the IPCC language as well. So the IPCC definition of climate change is not anthropogenic climate change, it's both. In the Framework Convention, that's one of the problems. And in politics, climate change means human-induced. So the greenhouse.
Okay, I think the next hand I saw was at the front.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. You started by framing your version of naturalism in opposition to scientific naturalism, and then you went through the process whereby what happens to that as you include uncertainty and doubt. And I wondered, as I was listening to you talking, particularly as where we ended up, was that are you actually changing the definition of what knowledge is and changing the definition of what the outcome of knowledge is? Because in the past, knowledge is a thing, it's a system, it's a structure, it's a defined concrete thing, and the outcome are facts which are either true or false. Whereas if we can lose that definition into understanding it more as a process of all these people talking with each other. But what's the outcome of that process? It still wants to be, we want to feel that it's true in some sense and it's valid, but it seems to me that the outcome of this process isn't so much a fact, which is only either binary, true or false, but it's more like a little bundle of, it's what is it more like? It's more like a sort of an asset. It's a little bundle of something that we can use in that process. It's something we can use, which can, like a poker chip or something. We can swap it for something and then use it in the. So that's still true. It's still valid. It's still authenticated, but it's lost its binary yes or no, and then we can now slot it into the program as it's a does that make any kind of sense to you?
I think it beautifully summarizes my position.
Okay. Well,
Yes,
but how do we get people off this yes or no? Either fundamentalist supernaturalists or scientismist science people.
Yeah. That is the big question. Of course, education is part of it, but it is very deeply embedded in. Well, when you are doing research, you really think you're hitting something real, the truth, right? The truth with a capital T, which I also want to acknowledge, that emotion, right? Because I do believe there is a truth out there. But there's nothing else than the resources that we have.
But it's not a binary.
Because you will never get there in that sense. So you will never get to that kind of binary outcome. One interesting case in between is mathematics, but I'm focusing on natural science, right? Because then mathematics is a separate discussion of philosophy of mathematics, which I could also formulate a position towards with this thinking. But it's hard to teach this because you still want people to believe that they're seeking something. You don't want it to be just rhetoric, because some people have misinterpreted Bruno Latour also like it's just rhetoric. No, it's just showing how difficult it is to come up with a position and then defend another position. Yes, it is about rhetoric, but it's also about building a laboratory and building this chain of reference with all these resources that you need to have to build a chain of reference. So yeah, but it's that I use that language about processes a lot. So thank you for that.
Brian, I think this will have to be the last question now, 'cause it's 2:00.
Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. And for those of us who sat through those interminable meetings where you get so many viewpoints from stakeholders, I was thinking about your group of uncertainties you listed there. Do you find yourself trying to develop a hierarchy that relates to the previous question in terms of the weighting that you give to particular uncertainties?
I haven't in a formal sense, but of course implicitly you do, right? Because you do take some things more seriously than others. But I have never written anything down on that or built a methodology out of that. Although there's a lot of tools to assess the, let's say, the methodological quality also of a comment. So is a comment based on their own research? Is a comment based, so you can also look at the backing that people have. So if I want to change something in IPC report, I make damn sure I've read the chapter. And I can tell them, I want this highlighted and not that. So those are ways to strengthen your argument. And in that sense, you create a hierarchy of how strong it is, the more reference then you make to underpinning evidence. But I didn't develop a specific hierarchy there.